Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am taking us back to a series that we've not had an episode for in a while, but it is my favourite series of the whole channel. Today we are going back to Napoleonic figures. Now in this series we look at the biography and the martial career of some of the lesser known figures from the Napoleonic Wars. And I'm looking for the guys with a larger amount than normal of daring, do, and dash, or at least who had a larger impact on the war than one person would normally have. Obviously, we're not talking about Napoleon or something like that. We're talking about the lesser known figures. Today we are talking about a man who was often overshadowed by the titans around him, by Kutuzov or Bagration or Barclay de Tolly, or even the Tsar and the Tsar's family himself. Today we are looking at the life and career of the man who was once called Russia's sword and shield, and Hugh Jackman lookalike, General Nikolay Nikolayevich Rayevsky. Now, as always, I will be pronouncing a lot of Russian words in this video. I will be mispronouncing 95% of them. So I hope you can put up with my butchering. I am going to do my best. And we should also point out, before we get started, that some specific dates may be a little out, usually because they give the dates in the Orthodox calendar and the Julian calendar. And sometimes, if there's only one date, I don't know whether it's the Julian or the Orthodox. So if I'm talking about a specific date, then it could be sort of up to 2 weeks either way. Obviously, if it's something that's a well-known date, like the Battle of Austerlitz or whatever, then that's fine. But if it's something that's internally Russian, then it may be a week or two either way. With that out of the way, settle in, fix yourself your favourite drink. I would recommend either a White Russian or just a straight vodka in this case. This is going to be an absolutely gargantuan episode, so I won't blame you if you break it into 2 or 3 parts. If you are going to do that, I'd recommend that you have a break after Austerlitz and just before 1812. But I obviously leave it entirely up to you. So, with all this in mind, let's crack on. Now, it was on the 25th of September, 1771, that Nikolay Nikolayevich Rayevsky was born into a noble family in the Russian capital of St. Petersburg. This family had a long noble heritage, being related way back in the family tree to Peter the Great himself. His father, Nikolay Semyonovich Rayevsky, had married Ekaterina Samoilova, the lady-in-waiting to Catherine the Great, and niece of Catherine's advisor, lover, and head of the army, Prince Potemkin. Now, these connections were doubtless vital in Nikolay Semyonovich becoming the colonel of one of the 2 premier guard regiments, the Izmailovsky Guard. Now, I've done a whole video on these guys and the rest of the guard infantry, but all we need to know in this case is that they were sent to fight in the Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774. It was whilst leading his men against the Ottomans at the Battle of Asai, that's I-A-S-I, I'm not entirely certain how it's pronounced, in present-day Romania, that mere months before the birth of his son, Nikolay Semyonovich, or Rayevsky Sr., was shot and killed. Now, it should be said that not for long was our boy Nikolay Rayevsky without a father figure for long. Catherine swiftly arranged a marriage to Lev Davidov, a rich landowner, and he would provide the funds for the young Nikolay to sort of represent himself at court. As was customary in the highest echelons of Russian aristocracy, at the ripe old age of 3, Nikolay was enrolled into the other noble guard infantry regiment, not the Izmailovskys, but the Preobrazhensky Life Guard Regiment. 3 years later, on the 30th of April 1777, now a grizzled 6-year-old, Rayevsky was promoted to sergeant before getting his commission to ensign on New Year's Day 1786. So that would make him 15. This meant that, 14 actually. This meant that the 14-year-old was now eligible for active military service. Potemkin arranged for his first real posting to be to a Cossack regiment. They had a belief back in those days, a thing called Cossack science, and that would toughen up the pampered prince. Still an unknown quantity, his commanding officer, General Kutuzov, who we may hear about later, handed Rayevsky an order pertaining to his time with the Cossacks. It read, quote, "Try if you are a coward. If not, strengthen courage by dealing with the enemy often," end quote. And these Cossack units would be constantly skirmishing with Ottoman, probably Bashi Basouks or other mounted skirmishers, and you'd have a short, sharp clash. Maybe someone would get killed or someone would be wounded, and then that'd be it for the next 2 or 3 days. So while there were no major conflicts going on at the time, then there was constant skirmishes. There was a second Russo-Turkish war. This one kicked off in 1787 to 1792, and Rayevsky would find himself taking part in this, a much more formalised affair with the National Army deployed. By now, he had become a premier major in the Nizhegorodiski Dragoon Regiment, a rank awarded to him personally by Catherine the Great. This war, as with most Russo-Turkish wars to be fair, was fought chiefly around the Black Sea, and in the hilariously named Siege of Bender and following Battle of Ackerman, Rayevsky distinguished himself to such an extent that he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel on the 1st of September 1790. Now, I tried to find details of the Siege of Bender, but I couldn't find much in English. But for a dragoon colonel to, be awarded a bravery distinction at a siege, it must have been something pretty impressive. I couldn't find anything on it. If you know more about the Siege of Bender, then let me know in the comments down below. This promotion to Lieutenant Colonel meant another change of pace to Rayevsky, as he was now transferred back to a regiment of Cossacks, this time as their commander. Now, this was not uncommon. In fact, if you look at the Perry miniatures, their command set for Cossacks comes with 2 Cossack troopers and a Russian-dressed commanding officer. So it was quite usual for that to happen, something that another Napoleonic figure, General Platov, was not super keen on. He preferred Cossacks to be commanded by the people that they knew culturally as well as familiarly. But that went on right through, I believe, until the revolution. So it was something that wasn't changed. Rayevsky spent 2 years commanding these mercurial-like cavalry raiders, and this time would really help him appreciate and gain valuable experience in the work of light troops. Now, this may be some foreshadowing that may be useful later. As was the case in Catherine's Russia, the drums of war beat again, and Rayevsky was pulled back from his Cossack regiment back to the Nizhegorodiski Dragoon Regiment, and this time he would be their commanding officer. He would maintain his rank as full colonel. And this time, they would be fighting in 1792 in the Russo-Polish War. And it was this conflict that would start to see the absolutely meteoric rise of Rayevsky, as he won several distinctions. The first of these was the Order of St. George 4th Class, or, to give it its full title, the Military Order of the Saint Grand Martyr and the Triumphant George. So I can see why they just call it the Order of St. George. This was presented to him on the 28th of June 1792, and the order statute reads, quote, "Neither a high origin nor the previous merits or wounds received in battle are taken into account, whilst attributing the Order of St. George for the feat of arms. Honoured with it are just those who not only achieve their obligations according to the oath of allegiance, honour and duty, but in addition to this, distinguished himself in battle to the benefit and glory of Russian arms," end quote. And this medal was accompanied by a gold sword inscribed "for bravery." Now, I have read that this gold sword came from Potemkin, but I think this may be a little late for Potemkin to be handing out gold swords, so I'd take that with a pinch of salt. Now, he was also awarded the Order of St. Vladimir 4th Class. Now, this one was inscribed "Benefit, Honour and Glory." And weirdly, one of the things that comes with having this order is you're not allowed to take it off your clothes. So, yeah, there you go. Now, this one's particularly important because it's limited to those of the 4th rank and above. Now, what do I mean by the 4th rank and above? So we're going to go back in time a little bit to the time of Peter the Great. Now, he went around Europe, he came back to Russia, and he decided that it was necessary to modernize the country. In his period, so I think he died in 1715, Russia was still very medieval. It was feudal. I was going to say it was almost feudal. No, it actually was feudal. It was the same as Western Europe had been in the 13th and 14th centuries. Now, the nobles weren't necessarily going to stand by this because they were going to see a huge reduction in their power. So, Peter the Great divided the classes of the country into the table of ranks, with one being the highest, being the king, and a 14th being the lowest, and that would be a serf. Now, there was some possibility to move up and down the order of ranks, but, so for argument's sake, if you were in the 5th rank and you lost all your money, you might drop down to the 7th or 8th rank. Now, titles and things like that did mean that there was a backstop. You couldn't fall too far. You weren't going to find any princes in the 14th rank, let's put it that way. But the Order of St. Vladimir was only available to those in 4th rank or higher. So that meant that Rayevsky, whatever happened to him, he and his family, him specifically, could never fall below the 4th rank. And this was a huge thing in Russian society. If you've seen War and Peace, you'll see, they go to the balls and there's, oh yes, that's Prince such and such. I can go and talk to him, but I can't go and talk to, Prince other such. And this is all to do with their location in the table of ranks. If you were a Russian noble, particularly if you were a Russian noble at court, you would know everyone's place on the table of rank, not least your own. And while Rayevsky was going to be fairly high up the table due to his stepfather's connections, this meant that he, on his own merits, could never fall below the 4th rank. Now, the Russo-Polish War is something that I don't know a huge amount about. I'm meaning to read more into it from what I've just discovered here. But it's my understanding they were actually doing quite well, but they surrendered, or they gave the Russians a favourable ceasefire. And this led to 250,000 square kilometres being added to Russia, as Poland was once again partitioned. With this minor conflict out of the way, Catherine turned her imperial attention to another war, this time against the newly minted Qajar dynasty, now ruling the Persian Empire, with fighting breaking out in 1796. Now, a quick side here would be that, in my opinion, the Russo-Persian War would be one of the most awesome looking games you can have out there. The Potemkin Russian uniform, I know Potemkin died in 91, but still, the Potemkin era uniforms are absolutely spectacular. And the Persians, they'd be mostly mounted with, if you had a base of 3 cavalrymen, you might have a banner per base. You might even have 2 banners per base. But they would look absolutely phenomenal on the tabletop. If you want, if someone was to say, oh, well, how much cavalry did the Persian army consist of? Then the answer is yes. Yes, it did. They've also got camels with artillery pieces on the back. I love my camels. What's not to great? Anyway, maybe one day I'll get round to doing the Russo-Persian War, but not today. Anyway, where the Tsarina sent her forces, Nikolay Nikolaevich marched with them. And this time, he had been transferred to head up the Nizhny Novgorod Dragoon Regiment. Now, unfortunately, Novgorod's in the news quite a lot recently, but it must be pointed out that while he was born in St. Petersburg, ethnically, Rayevsky was very much a Ukrainian. Under the overall command of Count Valerin Zubov, the war went astonishingly well for the Russians. Now, this wasn't entirely surprising. The Persian army was one pulled straight out of the late medieval period, perhaps even less developed in modern warfare than the Ottomans, and that is saying something. Rayevsky would command his dragoon regiment, and brigaded with the Vladimir Dragoons, he would serve under the command of someone else who you may have heard of, a Major General Bennigsen. Now, this wasn't a war of field battles, this was a war of sieges. And although, he managed it in the siege of Bender, this wasn't really the place for Rayevsky to show his best skills. Or was it? Yes, it was, because at the storming of the city of Derbent, a walled city in the snow-capped mountains by the Caspian Sea in modern Azerbaijan, Rayevsky once again distinguished himself. Despite his storm failing to capture the forts guarding the city walls, the commander of the Persian forces surrendered rather than risk the utter destruction of the city. His people turning against him, Sheikh Ali Khan made peace overtures to the Russians, eventually handing the keys of the city over to Colonel Rayevsky. Now, it is recorded by Nikolay Dubovrin, a Russian historian, writing 90 years later that the man who handed over the keys of the city was 120 years old and had been the same guy that had handed the keys to Peter the Great when he had conquered the city, which is almost certainly not true. But it's a fun story, so I thought I'd add it in. So despite capturing Derbent and then moving on to Baku, the end of this campaign came about with the death of Catherine and the crowning of her son Tsar Paul. Now, Paul was not a man of temperate feelings towards others, shall we say, and he absolutely hated his mother, and I mean he hated his mother, as well as her lovers, and particularly her lovers and their appointees. He reserved particular hatred for the brothers that were primarily responsible for the Persian campaign, the Zubovs. Of these, Platon Zubov had planned the campaign from the Queen's bedchamber, and his younger brother Valerin had commanded the army in the field. Tsar Paul not only ended the war and withdrew his troops, but he also purged the officers from their commands. Fortunately for our boy, this wasn't a Stalin-style purge, and they were merely dismissed rather than exiled to Siberia or worse. Nikolay Nikolayevich Rayevsky was firmly in the firing line due to his marriage to Potemkin's niece, and so in 1796 he was dismissed from the army. And that's the end of the episode. The rest of it's just white noise. I'm only joking, of course it's not. Luckily for the hero of our story, many of the officers that were dismissed were not too keen on Paul, and both his sweeping away of Catherine's court and his rather bizarre love of all things Prussia. Before long, these dismissed officers, along with some those still in service, shall we say, made Paul have an unfortunate series of accidents where he repeatedly fell on some knives. So they installed his son Alexander I as Tsar. It was in fact Nikolay Zubov that struck him with the sword, although it's believed that Tsar Paul was actually killed by being trampled to death, which is particularly grim. He may also have been strangled. Very unpleasant and probably a little bit worse than he deserved. But with him out of the way, Alexander was the man in charge, and it must be said he was almost certainly a better Tsar than Paul would have been if he'd been continuing to rule. With this turning of the wheel, Alexander recalled many of his grandmother's officers, including, as we mentioned, Matvey Platov and our boy Nikolay Rayevsky. This time, perhaps as something of an apology, he was recalled at the rank of Major General. Now, I have read that he refused the recall, but he accepted it several months later. So he may have resigned from the army and then re-enlisted, as it were, as the rank of Major General, or he may have just accepted Tsar Alexander's offer the first time round. There's a little bit of uncertainty either way there. But either way, he would not be a member of the Russian army during the absolute nadir on the frozen battlefield of Austerlitz. But with Mother Russia embroiled in war, he would soon don his uniform once again in 1807 and be in the thick of the fighting. Here he would serve as a divisional commander under his lifelong friend Prince Bagration. Raevsky commanded a brigade of Jaeger. Now, this may seem a strange choice for a man who spent his entire career commanding dragoons and Cossacks, but the roles of Jaeger and dragoons and Cossacks aren't massively dissimilar, to be honest, and light infantry in particular benefit from good, experienced leadership. Now, the 1807 campaign is a bit of a funny one. I don't want to get into it too deep here. It's a really interesting campaign, one that is rapidly increasing up my my rankings of favourite campaign. Maybe I'll do a video on that one day. But overall Russian commander, General Bennigsen, who had commanded Rayevsky in the Persian campaign, had divided his army into 6 columns, with Rayevsky finding himself and his Jaegers in the 3rd column, a formation numbering some 12,500 men, including the Jaegers, some line units, cavalry, and 6 regiments of Cossacks. Now, Rayevsky's Jaegers would get their first blooding on the 5th of June, 1807, at the lesser-known battle of Guttstadt. Here, Marshal Ney's corps had become isolated, pushing ahead of the rest of the French army, and the Russians meant to pounce. General Bennigsen had laid a cunning trap, perhaps a little bit too cunning, relying on Ney's reconnaissance being hampered by thick woods. The trap needed some cheese to make the bravest of the brave advance, a come on to pull him further forward while the other Russian columns enveloped his corps. To this end, Bennigsen sent a brigade of light troops of the 3rd column, of course commanded by our boy Rayevsky, to occupy the village of Altkirch. This they achieved with surprising speed, so much speed in fact, that they found themselves a little bit isolated, with the second and fourth columns having not even started moving up yet. Rayevsky held his men in the village, not wanting to risk them in the open to the huge number of light cavalry units that Ney had under his command. He had 4 hussar regiments and 2 chasseurs, and that's not to mention he was also commanding the 12th Dragoon Regiment. Ney was no blundering fool, though, and he took this opportunity to pull his troops back to the south, whilst launching a ferocious infantry attack on Altkirch. Whilst French casualties are not recorded, the Russian Jaeger lost about 500 men, so we can assume that being the attackers, the French casualties were at least comparable, probably 300 to 600. The trap sprung. All it would take was the envelopment of the future Prince of Moscow for victory to be complete. The 2 supporting columns were too slow, however, and Ney managed to extricate his men to the absolute fury of Bennigsen. Ney's account of the battle in his official dispatch to Imperial headquarters read, quote, "From 5 o'clock in the morning I was informed by my advanced posts that the enemy marched on Altkirch with a considerable force of infantry, cavalry and artillery. The enemy had established 4 main attacks, the first on Altkirch, the second on Amt Guttstadt, the third on Wulfsdorf and Lingnau, the fourth on Bergfried, the point where it crosses the left bank of the Aal. It wasn't yet about 11 o'clock in the morning that it had deployed in front of Lingau and Altkirch about 15,000 infantrymen, numerous artillery, and at least as many cavalry as I have in my infantry corps." He continued, "By 8 o'clock in the morning, I was enveloped completely, and my communications with Davout and Soult were cut, and the retirement was made at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in perfect order, and with a unity we rarely get in such a heated affair. At 4 o'clock I took position at Ackendorf, and the enemy stood before me at Kuitz. I felt, as well as the generals who accompanied me, that the 2 lines of infantry had 35 or 40,000 men." End quote. Now this was just Rayevsky's corps, so there probably was significantly fewer than that, but they obviously put on such a display that it managed to impress Marshal Ney. Now despite this tactical victory, it would be the Russians, defeated on the strategic scale, that would end up falling back, this time to a pre-prepared defensive position. I'm definitely putting my pop filter to work there, around the town of Heilsberg. Now this may seem strange at first. At Guttstadt, Bennigsen outnumbered the French 3-1, but as Napoleon moved the rest of his corps into position, that balance shifted. And additionally, the Cossacks had captured a dispatch rider with intelligence that Davout's corps was about to fall on the rear of the Russians. No general could allow encirclement such as this, and so he fell back. This dispatch, however, was a coup de guerre. It had been allowed to be captured to persuade Bennigsen to call off his attempts to destroy Ney. As Hilaire Belloc put it, quote, "Bennigsen, having failed in his attempt at a surprise attack, had nothing to do but fall back along the main which leads to Königsberg." End quote. As the Russian army fell back from their tactical victory at Guttstadt-Deppen, it fell to Marshal Murat with his 4 cavalry divisions to keep his sword in their backs. Forming the rearguard and attempting to buy time for the retreating army were the Jaegers of Rayevsky. This would have been a series of small actions. A platoon of Jaegers attacked by a half squadron of cavalry, perhaps trying to defend a bridge or a crossroads. A squadron of cavalry cutting off the path of a company of Russians. Now these are those small-scale actions that don't make it into the history books, but it's what takes out, 3, 4, 5, a dozen troops at a time. This is what we call the friction of war. And as a former commander of dragoons and Cossacks, Rayevsky would have been well versed in the tactics and counter-tactics of this style of combat. And surely enough, he and his men bought the Russians the time they needed. Well, needed for what, I hear you say? Well, it would be to complete the construction of those fortifications near the city of Heilsberg. Now, anyone familiar with Borodino, and I have no doubt we'll be coming to that later, will know what these look like. Chevron-shaped redoubts dug into the earth using natural contours, usually on the forward slope of a hill, and packed with artillery and musketeers. That was the order of the day. The Russian defences ran basically north and south, and the position was cut in half by the east to west River Aal. Now, the French marched on the northern side, while Rayevsky and his Jaegers were sitting pretty on the south side of the river. About 9:30 on the morning of the 10th of June, 1807, they were ordered to hurry across to the northern side, and joined a small force under General Barazdin, who were tasked with holding back the French cavalry. Again, they were used to this kind of action, and although there had been friction against them, they'd obviously been taken out of the line, they were to be called on back again. Now again, they weren't necessarily here to stop the French cavalry altogether, merely slow them down to enable the rest of the Russian troops to keep on digging these defences. This was their mission, which they achieved successfully. A heavy Russian cannonade persuading Marshal Murat to await further reinforcements. And these reinforcements arrived in the form of 600 chasseurs from Marshal Soul's corps, who are marching to catch up with the unfolding battle. The Battle of Heilsberg is one of those classic encounter battles where it starts off small and then the gravitational pull of marching to the sound of the guns just makes the battle grow and grow and grow. And these 600 chasseurs are a perfect example of that. Seeing these fresh horsemen, shakos bobbing and sabres glittering in the summer sun must have been something to behold, even for Rayevsky's men, bloodied and running short of ammunition from the morning's running skirmishes. They must have seen these fresh horsemen and steeled themselves to be swept away in a tide of metal and horseflesh. But then, from behind them, came the thundering of hooves. Clearly, having listened to my tactics article on the French, the Russian Commander General Bennigsen didn't wait for them to form up an attack. Instead, seizing the initiative, he launched his own cavalry into the fray. Soon, 25 squadrons of cavalry, including 15 Prussian squadrons, were thundering across the flat Polish landscape. Soon, dragoons, cuirassiers and hussars were throwing the French back, and now supported by Rayevsky's Jaegers, who moved forward to occupy Lorden village. Seeing it was garrisoned by the French, they formed on the edge of a wooded area and prepared themselves to launch an assault. This assault would never come, however. Sending forward the Imperial Guard, the French pushed the Russian cavalry from the field, allowing them to go onto the offensive once more. Soon, the men of Saint-Cyr and Saint-Hilaire's divisions were attacking the Jaegers, secreted amongst the trees, their dark green coats making them difficult targets beneath the summer foliage. The Jaegers were fighting individually, or at least in pairs, and they were fighting against the crashing of French line volleys. Soon as more French troops joined the fight, Rayevsky was forced to extend his line, stretching it longer and thinner to avoid being outflanked. Eventually, however, the French proved too much, and about 5:30 p.m, the Russians were forced deeper into the woods, abandoning their positions, leaving about 1,000 men dead on the field, over 50% of their original strength. Though the French had forced them back, a single division of the Russian advance guard had effectively held up an entire French corps. But for them and their commanders, this had only been the prologue. Being ordered back behind the ring of redoubts, the Russians sent one of their brigades to the south side of the river. Also on the south side of the river were the Russian Imperial Guard, under the command of Grand Duke Constantine, who, seeing the French forming up for an assault, ordered his heavy Imperial Guard guns unlimbered and provided supporting fire across the river at en echelon to the rest of the Russian army. This is one of the best ways to sight your artillery. By firing diagonally, the cannonballs would have scythed through multiple units at once, and it would have also increased the amount of time they could fire, because as the French columns closed with the Russians, they still wouldn't have been obscured by their own infantry. As I said, one of the divisions was sent south of the river, and I believe this was Rayevsky's division. There's not a huge amount about his contribution in the Battle of Heilsberg after holding up the initial French assault. So I do know that Bagration himself went to visit the division that was on the south bank. So that Bagration went to visit that division. So it is my assumption that that was Rayevsky's division. But if it wasn't, he was held behind the line of fortifications while his men rested and recuperated. Their battle had already been fought in the morning. Heilsberg, again, is one of those lesser-known battles. It's a fascinating dress rehearsal almost for Borodino and even Friedland to an extent as well. I'm not going to go into it too much here because that's the end of Rayevsky's involvement in the battle, but I may do a series on lesser-known battles at some point. Some highlights include the massive cavalry charge we talked about before, French assaults on redoubts numbers 1 and 2, the capture of the French Eagle of the 55th line by either Corporal Antonov of the Pernod Musketeers or perhaps a cavalryman from the Prussian Prittwitz Hussars. I talked a little bit more about the capture of this eagle in my part 2 of the Prussian army. Anyway, the fighting at the Battle of Heilsberg died down as night fell, but while I said the battle was over for Rayevsky, I was a little bit premature, for they had one last action. They had occupied a forested area towards the end of the battle, the Lorden Woods, and it had been lost late in the day. It was now to be retaken. Rayevsky's 2 battalions of Jaegers, now semi-rested and with ammunition resupplied, were sent in, commencing a fierce firefight. Eventually, they were forced back when a battery of French horse artillery galloped onto the flank of the Jaegers and began a murderous enfilade. As darkness enveloped the full battlefield, both armies settled down amongst the dead and wounded as a heavy summer rain fell. As the sun rose the following morning, the true horror of the battlefield was revealed, with French bodies before the redoubts, in some places lying 5 high. While girding themselves for a second day, word reached the Russian command that the Iron Marshal Davout's corps was moving round the northern flank like a long left hook, forcing Bennigsen to order the retreat, and crossing the river Aal to their back, they moved south away from the French. What had been a tactical stalemate was once again a strategic loss for the Russians. They lost about 2,500 men, with about 6,000 wounded. The French, while having fewer killed, at a weirdly accurate 1,398, had far more wounded, perhaps 10,059. The disparity perhaps the result of the desperate fighting in the redoubts. Many of the French casualties were caused by cannon fire, with Henri Lecoq later writing, quote, "The brave General Roussel, Chief of Staff of the Guard, had his head blown off by a shell. Curiel was severely wounded, marching at the head of the Fusilier chasseurs, who covered themselves in glory. Major Vrigny and Captains Schramm, Deshays, and Labousquet were amongst the wounded." End quote. So even the Imperial Guard took an absolute flaying. Rayevsky, while his men had been pulled out of the line and were resting and recuperating, he himself had been all over the battle, from the very beginning skirmishes to manning the redoubts to covering the retreats, and he himself was wounded. So my apologies, I misspoke earlier when I said that Rayevsky's battle was over. It was over for the division he commanded, but he himself would still be of use. While the overall commander Bennigsen did not perform particularly well, due in no small part to a flare-up of his kidney stone, Prince Bagration, the divisional commander of the Jaegers, and Rayevsky's direct commander, would receive high praise indeed by Petrie in Napoleon's campaign in Poland. Quote, "Bagration's conduct of his rearguard against Soult was admirable, as his fight on the previous evening before Guttstadt. His steadfast resistance wore out the enemy before they even arrived within striking distance of Bennigsen's line of battle." End quote. Rayevsky's contribution was noted at the time, with General Orlov writing, quote, "His positions passed from hand to hand several times, and Nikolay Nikolayevich, that's Rayevsky, himself first entered the battle and last of them came out, personally leading troops entrusted to the bayonets." End quote. And this charge he led whilst receiving not an insignificant wound to his knee. The Russians, now having moved to the south bank of the Aal, moved east, following the river as it curved round to the north. This meant they were on the outside of the bend of the river, which allowed the French on the inside, who, marching quicker than the Russians anyway, easily kept pace with them, both cutting off the Russian escape and allowing the French to be first to Kaliningrad on the Baltic coast. Bennigsen, keen to track and perhaps pull the French away from their prize, had sent elements across the river over a bridge at the town of Friedland, and these were the skirmishing elements of his army. These were the skirmishers, the Jaegers, commanded by Rayevsky. Just after midnight in the small hours of June the 14th, 1807, these Jaegers would be engaged by French skirmishers, scouts from Land's corps looking for the Russian forces. Soon, vicious fighting broke out amongst the trees of Shortlack Wood and the houses of Post Hennen, as Lannes and Bennigsen began feeding more and more troops, the former sending messages to the rest of the army, including the Emperor, and soon it became another escalation battle in its purest sense. Although eventually all of his men would be fed into the battle, Lannes' corps were not quite the same quality as the rest and termed a reserve army, numbering some 20,000 troops. The Russians, on the other hand, had over 40,000 men across the river by 6 a.m, and Lannes fought hard to hold them off, Rayevsky's Jaegers probing the French lines and pushing them back west of Shortlack Woods. The Russians, looking to build up a solid defensive line, prioritised their infantry to come over the bridge, while the French, keen to hold the enemy back, sent their cavalry into the fray, with Mortier's 8th Corps sending in the Polish chasseurs à cheval and a brigade of French dragoons to push the Jaegers back, seeking the refuge of the woods. Soon, Lannes was joined by Marshal Oudinot and his elite grenadier division, 2 battalions of whom were soon deployed entirely in skirmish formation. These men would now fight a running battle, hugely outnumbered by the 4,200 light Russian infantrymen. It was in the dark of the early morning under the canopy of these trees that Rayevsky was unsure of quite how many French troops were in the area, and, having secured the Russian left wing, they contented themselves with digging in. They would remain here for basically the rest of the day, allowing the sweating Russian gunners to duke it out with their French counterparts. Friedland is a fascinating battle in its own right. Napoleon, seeing that the Russians were trapped by the bend in the Aisle, used a tactic straight out of Alexander the Great's playbook, the hammer and anvil. While one part of the army pinned the Russians in place, the second would hit them with an overwhelming force that would crush them utterly against the impassable river. In this battle, Ney's corps would form the hammer, again pitting the bravest of the brave against General Rayevsky. At about 5 p.m, the Emperor judged that he now had the upper hand and signalled the announcement of the assault. A massive artillery storm hit Rayevsky's men, iron balls and wooden splinters showering the Jaegers and forcing them back, despite inflicting fairly light casualties, the men being dispersed amongst the trees. As the cannon fire faded away, they would have heard the drumming of the pas de charge, pausing only for the men to shout, "Vive l'Empereur!" Despite their best efforts, the Jaegers were soon driven back by the sheer size of the attack, and while the Russian army had been decisively beaten, casualties were fairly light. Well, I say light, they were light for an army that had been defeated and trapped. They fell back east towards the town of Tilsit, and, once again, Rayevsky and his Jaegers, forming the rearguard, fended off probing attacks from La Salle, Murat, and Grouchy, back when Grouchy was good. Casualties at Friedland were high enough, however, to force Tsar Alexander to the negotiation table, and soon the Treaty of Tilsit ended, the War of the Fourth Coalition, and everyone could go home. With the outbreak of peace and love between the Emperor and the Tsar, Raevsky returned to St. Petersburg back in time for tea and medals, and he was rewarded handsomely for his service, receiving the Order of St. Vladimir 3rd Class and the Order of St. Anne 1st Class. Of these two, the latter is the more important, cementing General Rayevsky in the top rank of nobles according to the table of ranks, the order that was headed by the Tsar himself. Additionally, they got to wear that really sweet-looking red sash that you often see on portraits and minis of the Russian generals. That's what that was for. That was for St. Anne 1st Class. Now, surely, having been called out of semi-retirement, being wounded in the knee, being rewarded for his service, General Rayevsky could look toward a time of peace. A nice, long-earned rest back in his estate, right? Yeah, no, don't be silly. The ink wasn't even dry on the parchment at Tilsit before the Russians were licking their lips and looking west, launching the invasion of Finland, then controlled by Sweden. This was ostensibly in order to enforce Napoleon's continental system. But, I guess the acquisition of more ports in the Baltic was just going to be, a nice unforeseen byproduct, I'm sure. On the 3rd of March 1808, the Russians put together a corps-level force made up of 3 divisions. One, the 21st Division, was commanded by General Bagration, and his command was made up of 2 brigades, including 2 battalions, each of the 2nd, 25th, and 26th Jaegers, commanded, of course, by General Rayevsky. While their time at peace had been short, Rayevsky had written of being back in his estate, quote, "Life here is unbearable. Whenever I carry a service, I would not complain. Now that they say things do not run from the case." Now that's some absolutely terrible Google Translate there, but he is clearly a man of action, and peace did not sit well with him, so I'm sure he was more than happy to follow his friend General Bagration to the Lithuanian front. Now, by and large, I know almost nothing about the Finnish war, so this is the best understanding I have of the campaign. You will almost certainly be out there and know more about it than me, but here we go, I hope, A series of running skirmishes saw the Swedes sacrificing land for time until June 1808, when the Swedish commander of the Northern Army, I'm not sure I've butchered Swedish yet in my channel, I'm just about to though, Colonel Johan Alderklutz, launched an attack at the town of Lapo, although I have seen it anglicised to Lapua. Rayevsky's division, numbering about 4,100 men, were now isolated in a poor defensive position, staring down about an equal number, perhaps slightly more Swedes. The Jaegers had been the tip of the spear. They had been searching for the Swedish army. They'd advanced a little bit too far. Now they were potentially isolated. Alderkrutz's plan was to surround the Jaegers, cut off the retreat, and crush them. To this end, the Bjornborg regiment had been the first to move, but grew increasingly frustrated by being held back from launching their assault, waiting for the other units to get into position. This waiting was carried out while Rayevsky's Jaegers were firing at them, wounding a man here, killing a man there. Remember, these are Jaegers, they are riflemen, some of them are riflemen, and they are taking aim shots here. Their commander, Karl von Dobhelm, who would later have an epic poem written about him, could wait no more, and, before being ordered by his commander, he launched his assault on Rayevsky's men. As an aside, I looked a little bit into this Dobhelm guy. He looks absolutely awesome. He was shot in the head in the 1798 Battle of Porasalami, and he was forced to wear a silk bandana for the rest of his life. During the surgical operation immediately after being hit, he watched the operation on his own head with a mirror and wrote down the experience. An absolute mad lad. The Jaegers, who had moved out to skirmishing in front of the village, with the main body waiting inside for the attack. Still, in despite of the preparedness, von Dobeln and his men swept through the skirmish screen and straight into the village, clearing it whilst killing, wounding and capturing some 200 Russians. However, due to the premature attack, Rayevsky was able to extricate himself and most of his men, saving them for another day, but not his immediate reputation. After the defeat, General Rayevsky was replaced by fellow veteran of the Russo-Turkish War, Count Nikolay Kamensky, who, incidentally, was the second son of actress Helen Mirren's, now let's make sure I get this right, great-great-great-grandfather. Now, it must be said that this guy, Count Kamensky, was an excellent commander, being, quote, clever, generous, and free with praise. He could also be really, really unpleasant. Think General Van Damsky, and you're about there. Louis Langeron, a Frenchman who fought with the Russian army in the Turkish War, recorded in his memoirs that after, this is in the earlier war, that after being upset that a storm had hit the army, a furious Kamensky took all the Tartar prisoners the army had captured and beheaded them. He later would have a Jew tied naked to a post and cold water sprayed on him, leaving him to freeze to death. Later in this campaign, the Swedish campaign, Kamensky had a village burned, leaving its inhabitants in the snow to die of cold and hunger due to him taking the surviving animals with the army. Suffice it to say, he was not a particularly pleasant man, and the Russians didn't think so either, because he would be killed in 1809 by one of his own serfs. So, there you go. Anyway, back to Rayevsky, who, despite being moved, shuffled sideways, I think it's safe to say, stayed at the front and took part in all the major engagements of the war, being awarded the Order of Vladimir second class, an advancement on the third class he previously had. Now again, this medal, very important, because it meant that his position on the table of ranks became hereditary. So before, he couldn't have fallen below the fourth rank of the table. Well, now he couldn't fall beneath the third rank. But this meant that his family couldn't either. The war was to come to an end with the Treaty of Frederikshamn on the 17th of September 1809. But not for Rayevsky the sweet fruits of peace, because he basically went straight from the frozen north to the Balkan front and the army of Moldova for another crack at those Ottomans. The war here had been raging for 3 years, and the Tsar considered it was time for a shake-up. This is perhaps fair enough when you consider that the general in charge, Prince Alexander Prozorovsky, had actually served in the 7 Years' War. So this guy, 76 at this time, was probably due for a nice warm front room with his feet up and his slippers on, I think. So, having got the call, General Rayevsky made his way south, and he would serve under his old friend, General Bagration. Now, while I said old Prince Prozorovsky deserved to sit down with his feet up, he obviously didn't believe that, and he stayed with the army. Unfortunately for him, he would only survive 2 more months, dying as the army crossed the Danube on the 21st of August 1809. I'm sure in absolutely natural causes, no suspicious circumstances to be seen here. However, Bagration also met with limited success, and a year later, he would in turn be replaced by Nikolay Kamensky, the son of the head-chopping, Jew-freezing Nikolay Kamensky. The only action Rayevsky saw on the Balkan front that year was the aborted siege of the formidable medieval walled city of Silistra, and after a failed attack on another fortified town, Shumla. In June 1810, openly critical of Kamensky, Rayevsky was expelled from the army, returning to St. Petersburg for some well-earned time away from the front, commanding the 26th Infantry Division. Now, this time seems the best time to discuss Rayevsky's personal life. As we've seen, he clawed his way up the table of ranks through his own birthright, but also through his merit, and with a little help along the way. Way back in 1794, before Tsar Paul dismissed him from the army, he had married Sofia Alexandrovna Konstantinova, the granddaughter and heiress of a scientist, Mikhail Lomonosov, the founder of modern geology, and also the guy that discovered that Venus had an atmosphere. So, quite an interesting guy. To be honest, he invented and discovered an absolute ton of stuff, which meant that his daughter's hand came with a fat dowry, including the Oranienbaum, where Stravinsky was born, and over 6,000 serfs. Oranienbaum was built, as the name suggests, as an orangery, and was so close to St. Petersburg that it is now within the city limits. They would go on to have 6 children together, 2 boys and 4 girls. His youngest and favourite was Maria, who we will discuss very briefly later on. Ensconced in his estates and in high societal balls, he would enjoy the fruits of his labour for the next 2 years. Europe was largely at peace, although Napoleon's Spanish also was beginning to fester and grow. But Central and Eastern Europe lived under the continental system with varying degrees of enforcement. If you wanted to get stuff from England, certainly General Rayevsky would have no problems whatsoever getting hold of it. But the storm clouds were gathering, and on the 24th of June 1812, Napoleon, at the head of 500,000 men, crossed the Niemen River and invaded Russia. The Great Patriotic War had begun, and Rayevsky would once again be summoned to defend the motherland. So, welcome back to part 2, and in the last 47 minutes we have been leading up to this point. This is the War of 1812 and Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Returning to the colours, Rayevsky would serve in the Second Army under the command of his old friend Prince Bagration as commander of the 7th Infantry Corps. This formation consisted of 2 divisions, each of 2 infantry brigades, and 1 Jaeger brigade. Units under his command included the 5th, 6th, 41st and 42nd Jaeger, the Smolensk and Novgorod infantry, and the Aktrisky Hussars, all in a formation totaling about 18,000 men. The Second Western Army's role was to flank the First Army and was deployed along a 50-mile front between Volkovsk and Belostok in modern-day Belarus, basically holding the road between Warsaw and Minsk. When it became clear that Napoleon's main thrust would be to the north, Rayevsky would be left with the task of delaying Davout's First Corps. Unfortunately for the Russians, the Iron Marshal drove his men on at a pace and reached Mogilev, also called the Battle of Saltnikova, on the 23rd of July. Through the town ran the roads for both Orsha, the provincial capital, and Smolensk, a large walled city and a major objective for Napoleon's main thrust. Also, this town would have been Bagration's place across the Dnieper, but now he was forced to move further upstream, leaving Rayevsky to hold off the French. Davout, arguably the best of Napoleon's marshals, knew the Russians would be coming for this prime piece of real estate, and so set his troops to fortifying the town of Mogilev by making loopholes to fire from, demolishing line-of-sight blocking buildings, and having light infantry pickets in the woods in front of the town. The man tasked with clearing the French out of this prepared position was General Ivan Paskevich, the former ADC to the Tsar himself. He wrote a superb memoir after the war, and rather than me stumbling around trying to do the battle some justice, this is a rather long quote from Mogilev, but this about Mogilev, I should say, from Paskevich describing the battle. Quote, "Therefore the prince ordered me to attack them," that's Davu's troops, "and after it to occupy the town of Mogilev. Early in the morning of the 11th, by the Russian Gregorian calendar, so the 23rd of June this would be, we began to advance. Between us and the enemy was a distance of 5 kilometres. In 1¼ kilometres we encountered his infantry of the advance guard and ousted them from the wood. Marshal Davout himself expected an attack and, beforehand, prepared the defence. The bridge at Sultanovska had been demolished and the walls of the tavern were cut through with gun loopholes, situated on the left side of the ravine, covering all of the line of the French. The bridge at the Fatavoy mill had been demolished, and in the neighbouring houses loopholes were also made. 3 battalions had been placed near Sultanovka, 1 battalion at Fatovnoy, having for themselves in reserve another 5 battalions. 4 battalions were between Fatavoy and the villages of Seltsen, and near the ravine and in front of the last village had been placed 2 more battalions. So that's the dispositions, interrupting here, that's the dispositions of the French forces. So he continues, "In the middle of the wood, I met our engaged skirmishers withdrawing from the French skirmishers. The enemy on this road outflanked our left. The firing of my 1st battalion had stopped and had overrun the enemy. I ordered them to drive them to the edge of the woods, and followed with the rest of the troops, leaving these woods, skirmishing with the enemy, laying behind a small rising and in front of the town of Fatavoy. Behind them I caught the sight of glittering bayonets of 2 French columns. The distance between them was no more than 130 metres. The dense wood did not allow me to turn the troops in column. I was forced to move to the right in sections, to leave the wood and form them at the front edge. The firing continued." He continues, "Colonel Rayevsky was to attack with a shout of 'Hurrah!' on the enemy as far as the stream, to overthrow those on the bridge, and having occupied the first houses on that side, to wait for my orders. The enemy was immediately overthrown and ran as far as the bridge. Seeing that the battalion passed the bridge, I brought forward 12 guns onto the heights and ordered the Poltava regiment, under the cover of the battery, to also go on that side. Having moved up the battery 6 more guns, and having placed Ladoga regiment on the left flank, I set off to the right flank, and to my astonishment I had found that the enemy skirmishers were ensconced there in a ravine. Our artillery, losing men and horses, drew off from the position. I stopped them, having ordered the Poltava regiment to halt, riding farther and expecting to meet the Orlov and Nizhny Novgorod battalions, and seeing 2 battalions departing from the wood to the rear of my position, I galloped toward them, but to my surprise I saw at 30 paces French grenadiers. Colonel Achard ordered about. The French charged our battalion. 'Lads, forward!' I shouted to the Poltava regiment. They hesitated. 'Hurrah! Charge!' From the men I heard a voice. 'Even the artillery is with us.' Well, I said, 'Hold there.' Riding towards the artillery arranged behind my position was a battery of 4 guns returning towards the Poltava regiment. The enemy, having seen their retreat, began with shouts of 'En avant!' The regiment made way and case shot struck into the French battalions. They stopped confused. I drew up to the Poltava regiment, ordered 'Hurrah! Forward!' They charged and drove the enemy up to the bridge." So this is the opening parts of the battle. There's a skirmish happening between probably a French battalion, and while he goes between the regiment and battalion, he's probably talking 2 to 4 Russian battalions up against 1 or 2 French ones at the moment. The Russians seem to be protected by some artillery, so it's going pretty well for them at the moment. So he continues. At this time, I heard on the right a severe firefight. This was General Rayevsky attacking the front of the enemy's position. The woods surrounding the village of Sultanovka did not allow any other approach. On the main road was an enemy battery. At the end of the road was a bridge. The Smolensk regiment of the 12th Division moved forward with astonishing firmness, but could not seize the bridge. Generals Rayevsky and Vasil Chikov dismounted to walk in front of the column. But the advantage of the enemy situation destroyed all the exertions of our courage and our soldiers. They could not burst into the village, and on the road endured all the fire of the enemy's battery." End quote. Rayevsky was leading the Smolensk regiment in an attempt here to capture what turned out to be like an earthen dam. This was, remember, we're fighting over the Poltava River, and this dam is quite typical in that area of, well, now what's now Belarus. It's not so much like a dam, it's more like small dikes in order to irrigate the various fields and things like that in the area. That said, it does provide a mud rampart, perfect for a defensive position. He also knew that if he could drive the French out of this position, it would be an excellent cover for him from French artillery. So, as was quoted, he led this attack on foot, and there are rumours that he was joined by both of his sons, Alexander and Nikolay, then 16 and 11 respectively. Now, Rayevsky would later deny that this was the case, presumably not least to his wife. He would later say, quote, "It's true that I led the attack. When the men drew back, I encouraged them along with the other officers. On the left side, everyone was killed or wounded, and grape shots struck near me. But my children were not there at that moment. That's it. The whole story was made up in St. Petersburg by engravers, journalists, and writers. And that's how history is written. Et voilà, comment on écrit l'histoire." End quote. So, whether his sons were there or not, I don't know. But that'd be quite a nice little command base if you're ever planning on making a General Rayevsky command base. Unfortunately for the Russians, Rayevsky, clearly rolling a 666, did not launch his assault on the prearranged signal, the opening of a heavy artillery bombardment. By the time he'd got to the objective, the French were able to fight them off, inflicting heavy casualties. General Paskevich continues, quote, "Rayevsky reported to Bagration that 2,458 officers and men had been killed, wounded, and missing. French casualties were of a similar proportion. An officer of the Poltava Infantry Regiment who had lost an arm from a cannonball," and this is now General Paskevich quoting, "calmly picked it up and left the battlefield. As he was passing Bagration, he saluted him with the remaining hand." End his quote and end quote. This attack, this minor battle, had clearly stirred the imagination, however. As Rayevsky said, engravers, artists, and writers would certainly talk about it. And not only was it painted by Mykola Samokhish, which should be the painting on the screen now, but Tolstoy included it in Chapter 12, Book 3 of War and Peace. So this is quoting the chapter and verse from War and Peace. Quote, "Another officer, whose face was literally hidden behind a gigantic pair of moustaches, rushed in, overtaken by the squall. 'I've come from headquarters,' he said. 'Have you heard, Count, of Rayevsky's exploits?' And I told him the details of the Battle of Saltanovka. The mustachioed officer, whose name was Zerginsky, made his story graphic. To hear him, you might have thought that the dike at Saltanovka was at least as important as the pass of Thermopylae, and that General Rayevsky's conduct in going forward onto the dike with his two sons was comparable to that of the heroes of antiquity." End quote. Now, it must be said that Tolstoy, in writing Count Rostov's response, is not particularly impressed. This battle is actually a scenario on page 122 of A Clash of Eagles, and this one may be coming to the channel in the not-too-distant future. We'll have to see. Anyway, despite failing to dislodge the Iron Marshal's troops, Rayevsky and his men had pinned them back long enough for Bagration to build his crossing over the bridge, his bridge, and cross the Dnieper at Stary Bykhov. So it wasn't the Poltava, it was the Dnieper that we're fighting over, allowing the Second Army to retreat towards Smolensk and link up with Barclay de Tolly's First Army on the 4th of August. This linking of the armies saw a change in policy. While up until now, the Russians had been conducting a Fabian retreat, which is named after the Roman dictator that stymied Hannibal, the combination of these two armies saw many in the Tsar's court demanding they take a more aggressive approach. With the godless French approaching the sacred city of Smolensk, try saying that 10 times, and its cathedral, housing some of the Russian Orthodox Church's greatest icons, one belonging to St. Luke the Evangelist, the other to the Virgin Mary herself, the Tsar ordered de Tolly to engage the invaders in battle. This counterattack was an absolute disaster, with Napoleon threatening to take out the entire army, Jena-Auerstadt style. Murat's cavalry reaped a bloody harvest at the Battle of Krasnoy, and this battle would see the Russians forced into square. We have an eyewitness account from a 15-year-old Russian soldier, Dmitry Dushenkovich, gaining his first taste of battle. Quote, "Everything seemed incomprehensible to me. I felt that I was still alive, saw everything that was going on around me, but simply could not comprehend how this awful, indescribable chaos was going to end. To this day, I can still vividly recall Rayevsky riding around the square every time the cavalry approached with his sword drawn, and, repeating in a voice which seemed to exude confidence, said, 'Lads, remember what you were taught in Moscow. Follow our orders, and no cavalry will defeat you.'" The square did, end quote for now, the square did manage to survive by and large, but this counterattack had failed to stop the French advance. David Chandler wrote of Napoleon's overall strategic plans, quote, "Almost all commentators agree that this operational plan constitutes one of Napoleon's masterpieces. It was a maneuver of strategic envelopment worthy of the one that preceded his great triumph at Jena Auerstadt in 1806, and if it had been succeeded, the fruits of victory would have been no less impressive." End quote. So, to be fair to the Russians here, they were facing one of history's greatest generals at the absolute peak of his game. Napoleon and Bagration retreated back to the medieval walls of Smolensk, walls that Rayevsky and his 7th Division had spent time reinforcing. Packed into the ancient citadel were 20,000 men and 72 guns, and in spite of the mauling the Russians had received at Krasnoy, Bagration wanted again to take the fight to the French. But Napoleon, as supreme commander, won out. Orders were put in place to continue the retreat to Moscow and abandon the sacred city. On the evening of the 15th of August 1812, Murat, May, and Davout arrived at Smolensk and launched into an immediate assault, which was thrown back by Rayevsky's defenders before they even made it to the walls. The Russians had been expecting this full-scale attack, but Ney only had with him 19,000 infantry, which was less than the defenders, so he awaited for the arrival of the Emperor the next day. Napoleon arrived about 1 o'clock on the 16th and set in for a siege. By this time, Rayevsky had been reinforced with the 7th Corps of Dokutirov, the 7th and 24th Divisions, and the 3rd Division under Konovnitsyn. Neverovsky's 27th Division also remained in the city. This brought the total number of troops, Russian troops in Smolensk, to 20,000 men and 180 guns. Against this were arrayed 185,000 French with 300 guns. Smolensk is a weird battle. I really liked the Battle of Smolensk. It's not a field battle, it's not a siege, it's kind of a little bit of both. Rayevsky had positioned his garrison behind the walls, but also in the open ground and suburbs before these walls. Smolensk had outgrown its Polish medieval size, and as soon as imperial headquarters were set up, Napoleon launched his attack, accompanied by a massive artillery bombardment. The Russians, not too shabby in their own artillery department, fired back until a storm of iron flew between the two sides. As August Thurion of the 2nd Cuirassiers describes the Battle of Smolensk thusly, quote, "I cannot conceive how a single man or single horse could escape from that mass of cannonballs coming from both sides. We saw our infantry laboriously descend into the ditches, or rather the ravines, which made up the moat of the fortress. It was a Polish division which was trying to storm these rocks with a courage and desperation worthy of greater success. These brave men tried to scale them by climbing on each other's shoulders." End quote. This ferocious artillery duel soon set the wooden city of Smolensk on fire, and it began to rapidly burn. Marching towards this mighty plume of smoke were the reserve armies of Bagration and Barclay de Tolly. De Tolly was only here to pick up the troops currently in Smolensk before pulling back to Moscow. Many Russian commanders hated this Fabian strategy, although it seemed to be the most prudent. Napoleon had wanted and deployed his men to capitalize on a general engagement, and a furious Bagration called de Tolly a German sausage maker for his policy of retreating. Even Grand Duke Constantine got stuck in, saying of the planned retreat, quote, "It isn't Russian blood that flows in those who command us," end quote. Thus it was on the evening of the 17th that powder stores were blown in the city, bridges burned, and the Russian army attempted to slow the French pursuit as they moved east. Rayevsky had done all that was asked of him, and so he and his men were rotated out of the front, or I guess in this case the rear line. The Russian rearguard under General Kononotzin and Colonel Toll fought desperately and continued to hold back the French. Russian Jaegers, scattered in gardens and hidden by the smoke of the burning city, sniped at the advancing Russian infantry. A participant of the battle, Fabre de Foray, wrote, quote, "Amongst those sharpshooters, one Russian chasseur, or Jaeger, distinguished himself by his staunchness and bravery. He placed himself right opposite us on the very bank of the river behind some willows, and we could silence him neither by concentrating our fire on him nor by the use of a gun, which demolished all the trees behind him." That's a cannon. "He continued to shoot, and we did not stop until that night. On the following day we visited this memorable position out of curiosity and found the body of our foe face downward among broken and splintered trees. A non-commissioned officer of the Russian chasseurs, he had been killed by one of our cannonballs." End quote. So even in 1812, you had to call in artillery to take out snipers. So there you go. Smolensk, the battle, we have not really covered it here, but it had been an absolute bloodbath. One of the bloodiest days of the Napoleonic Wars so far. The Russians, tired of retreating, were eager to fight. A witness of the Battle of Smolensk said, "I found the commander of the regiment, Major General Sibiliski, in full uniform, mounted on horseback amongst his marksmen. He replied that he was unable to restrain his men, who, after exchanging a few shots with the French, repeatedly tried to dislodge them by bayonet assaults, without awaiting orders. Even as he spoke, there was a shout of 'Hurrah!' from the line of men. Colonel Zabluski, began to shout, and even drove the marksman back with his sword. At his presence, his command was obeyed, but only a few paces from him, cries of 'Hurrah!' resounded again and again as the men flung themselves on the enemy. Many other regiments acted likewise. Light wounds were ignored until the wounded fell from exhaustion and loss of blood." End quote. Indeed, Rayevsky's example had been followed well. The French had lost 7,000 killed and wounded, the Russians about 11,000. The city of Smolensk was almost entirely destroyed, only 350 buildings remaining from the 2,250 that had formed the city, while less than 1,000 of its inhabitants from the original 15,000 had stayed. A large reason that Smolensk was all the more terrible was that the wounded of the previous battles, so Rayevsky's fight against Davout at Mogilev, as well as Vitebsk and the Krasnoy disaster, had been evacuated to Smolensk. Thus, thousands of wounded were gathered in the old city and left without appropriate medical attention. During the battle, after the wooden buildings of the old city had caught fire, saving the wounded was all but impossible. After entering the city, Raymond Faure, we heard from him earlier, wrote about the horror, quote, "Russian soldiers trying to flee had fallen in the streets, asphyxiated by the fire, and had been burned there. Many no longer resembled human beings. They were formless masses of grilled and carbonized matter, which the metal of a musket, a sabre, or some shreds of accoutrement laying beside them made them recognizable as corpses." End quote. The Russians had died hard, but they continued to retreat east. However, atop a slight ridge, the Russians would commit to stand, where 3 Russian armies converged near the town of Borodino. The Russians, knowing they were making a stand, began to dig in. We saw earlier that they liked to create redoubts at the Battle of Heilsberg. These large areas dug out of the ground were absolutely crammed with artillery and men. The French referred to these as flèches after their word for arrow, as the V shape of them represents our arrowheads. A series of these flèches were built, but one stood at the centre of the line, the Great Redoubt. This is often referred to by a different name, by the name of the general that commanded its garrison. It is often known as the Rayevsky Redoubt. On page 82 of his book, The Battle of Borodino, modern author Alexander Mikab-Rizdi describes it thus, quote, "This fortification, later known as the Rayevsky's Redoubt, was built by the troops of the Moscow Opolcheny under the direction of Lieutenant Liprandi and Bogdanov. The redoubts were constructed in the shape of a wide V with 2 72-metre-long epaulements, shoulders, converged at over 100-degree angle and were reinforced by 2 19-metre flanks. According to Bogdanov, by the time he saw it at 11 p.m. on the 6th of September, the fortifications were surrounded by a 7.3-metre wide and 3.1-metre deep ditch. Sent to help construct the redoubt, Bogdanov was met by Rayevsky, who told him that, and this is quoting Rayevsky, due to the open and rolling terrain, the redoubt can be attacked by cavalry." End quote. There's a bit of foreshadowing for you there. Rayevsky himself wrote, quote, "We built these batteries ourselves. A sapper officer advised us to dig a series of wolf pits 150 metres before the redoubt, as the position was at risk of being overrun by cavalry. We did this, and now all we had to do was await the enemy. To protect from cavalry, 6, although I have heard some sources say 10, wolf pits were dug in front of the redoubt. Now, while I hoped that a wolf pit would be a pit filled with starving wolves, unfortunately that's not the case. These are like trenches, they're a bit like open graves, and they were dug to break up infantry formations, but more importantly, to stop cavalry charges. If the cavalry charged over the wolf pit, the horses would fall in, break legs, all that kind of horrible stuff, and the charge would falter. Now, despite Rayevsky's claims that they built these field fortifications themselves, the Russian engineers certainly helped out. As I said, we had the quote from Bogdanov earlier on, and he continued, "It was necessary, despite the very limited time, to reinforce both flanks with brustwehr, and ditches, whilst opening in the rear, were to be closed by a double palisade with 2 openings on the sides. We used wood and iron from nearby villages that were taken apart." End quote. Now, it must be said, these Russian engineers did not slack in their work. And by the opening barrage at 6 a.m. on the 7th of September, they had managed to reinforce the flanks of the Fleches by putting up a double palisade with an 8 feet high outer and a 6.5 feet high inner walls. So in meters, that's probably, about 2.5 meters. And then on the inside, maybe 2 meters. Packed into it initially were the 12 guns of the 26th, and the 6 guns of the 47th Light Companies, although some light artillery companies, although some sources indicate that 6 guns of the 12th Battery Company might have been deployed there. To be honest, the size and occupation of the redoubt is a little unclear. As we mentioned him earlier on, Mika Beridze writes in his book The Battle of Borodino, quote, "The number of guns initially set up inside the redoubt varies in sources. French scholar Trany and the Russian Larionov estimated as many as 24, whilst Bogdanov, who helped construct the fortification, referred to 19. Yermolov, Toll, and other Russian participants reported 18 guns, which is usually acknowledged to be closer to the truth. Still, historians Gorau, Palmer, Thier, Holzhausen, and others argue there were 12 pieces in the redoubt, whilst Skugorevsky claims as few as 8. Rayevsky instructed his artillerymen to defend their guns to the last, and ordered draft horses and ammunition caissons to be sent away, in case there was a real threat of the enemy seizing the redoubt. He remained on foot inside the fortification, since he was suffering from a wound sustained a few days before. When was this man not wounded? Regardless of the number of guns, there were probably 6 or 8 pounders, particularly if it was the light one. Although they did mention the positional battery, which would be huge 20-pounder guns. A battalion of the Poltava Infantry Regiment was assigned to defend the guns. Now, as an aside, I have looked up their unit colours to see if I have them in my army. They're a dark green and orange. Absolutely stunning. They look great. Not in my collection. Not yet, anyway. Rayevsky was happy with the efforts of his men in the redoubt. Inspecting it in the early morning, he said, quote, "Now, gentlemen, we can be assured. Emperor Napoleon saw a simple open battery yesterday, but his troops will find a true fortress here today." End quote. Tolstoy described it as, quote, onto the high knoll on which militiamen were at work excavating, this was the redoubt, as yet unnamed, afterwards called Rayevsky's Redoubt, or the Battery on the Mound. The redoubt consisted of a mound with trenches dug out of 3 sides of it. In the entrenchment stood 10 cannons, firing through the gaps left in the earthworks. In a line with the redoubt, on both sides stood cannon. End quote. The Russian position consisted of a chain of these redoubts running north to south, with the Great Redoubt being slap bang in the centre, just behind and further up the slope from the town of Borodino. It was a small rise, but an important one. Napoleon's signal to begin the battle began with a pounding from the Grand Battery, 102 guns in all, and that hard pounding fell on the Great Redoubt. In his book Moscow 1812, Zamoyski would write, quote, "At 6 a.m. the French guns opened up. The Russians answered. To all those present, even those who had been in battle before, it seemed as though all hell had been let loose. While the earthquakes tried to protect the Russians from the worst of the fire, they did not sit passively in their trenches. After all, in addition to the garrison of the Great Redoubt, Rayevsky was in command of 2 infantry divisions comprised of 6 Jaeger regiments, supported by an 18-gun artillery brigade. The bulk of the Jaegers were positioned in a skirmish line on the slopes to the Redoubt's front, there to disrupt any French assault, whereas the 2 infantry divisions and 19th Jaeger were posted alongside and to the rear, ready to launch counterattacks against the French. At first, the battle started relatively quiet for Raevsky and his boys. While they had come under a massive sustained bombardment, Napoleon's main thrusts came to the north and to the south of the Great Redoubt, whose earthen walls were putting up a mighty defence. Things did not go well for the Russians in either of these assaults, with the Bagratian flèches to Raevsky's south being overrun by the French and the general himself wounded. Hearing this, Raevsky tried to take over command, but the continuing storm of French artillery made leaving his earthworks suicide. Luckily for him, the reserve grenadiers had already been sent in and pushed the French back out. At about 9:30, sensing the time was right, Viceroy of Italy, Eugène de Beauharnais, launched his first attack, sending General de Division Jean-Baptiste Boussier's men forward. These men from the 18th Léger, 53rd Line and Joseph Napoleon Regiment were welcomed by sustained fire from the Jaegers and driven back without major issue. So, job done? Not quite. This had been something of a reconnaissance, and just over an hour later, General de Division Morand sent in 5 battalions of the 30th Foot. Captain Francois, a company commander of the 30th Line, wrote, a great number of Frenchmen fell into the wolf pits, pell-mell, with Russians who were in them already, end quote. So they didn't have the starving wolves, but they had angry Russians in there. Eventually they reached the fortifications. Captain Francois continues, quote, nothing could stop us. We hopped over the round shot as it bounded through the grass. Whole files and half platoons fell, leaving great gaps. General Bonamy made us halt in a hail of canister in order to rally us, and we went forward at the pas de charge. A line of Russian troops tried to halt us, but we delivered a regimental volley at 30 paces and walked over them. We then hurled ourselves at the redoubt and climbed in by the embrasures. I myself got in through an embrasure just after its cannon had fired. The Russian gunners tried to beat us back with ramrods and levering spikes, and we fought hand to hand with them. They were formidable adversaries. End quote. The Russians had been driven out of the redoubt, fleeing back to their support line of grenadiers. Rayevsky wrote of this attack, quote, the smoke hid the French so completely that we could see nothing of their array or ascertain what progress they were making. There was one of my orderly officers standing a little to the left of me, and another volley he cried out, Your Excellency, save yourself. I turned around, and 15 yards away I saw French grenadiers pouring into my redoubt with fixed bayonets, end quote. Now, I have read that Barclay de Tolly had to personally rally the troops fleeing from the Great Redoubt, forming them up behind their brigade commander, General Yermolov, although I suspect it was probably General Yermolov himself who was the chief of staff who did it. It was certainly he that brought up 3 horse batteries and 2 infantry battalions from the reserve to stiffen the counterattack. Rayevsky, who had been driven out of the fortification, also rallied his infantry corps, and, with the cry, Hurrah! They threw themselves back into the redoubt. General Ermolov took a handful of crosses of the Order of St. George and threw them into the redoubt. Within 10 minutes, the French had fled, and the redoubt was back in Russian hands. Eugène tried to marshal his Italians for a counterattack, but Krutz's 3rd Cavalry Corps advanced, stopping the attack before it could even begin. As successful as the attack had been, and as short-lived as the French occupation was, the Russians had suffered a mighty blow. The commander of the artillery for the entire Russian army, General Kutsayov, had been killed in the fighting. General Rayevsky described the counterattack in a later letter he sent, quote, the enemy drew up his whole army in front of our eyes in what resembled a single column and came right up to our front. On approaching our front, strong columns separated from the enemy's left flank and went right for the redoubt, where, despite the heavy canister fire of my guns, they, without firing a shot, clambered across the breastworks, while at the same time on the right flank, Major General Paskovich with his regiments launched a bayonet attack on the left flank of the enemy troops which were beyond the redoubt. Major General Vasil Chikov was also struck on the enemy's right flank, and Major General Yermolov, taking a battalion of Jaegers from the regiment brought up by Colonel Vuich, made a bayonet attack directly on the redoubt, where they destroyed all the enemy remaining in it and captured the general. So this was the previously mentioned General Bonamy, who led the enemy column. Major Generals Vasil Chikov and Paskevich then overturned both enemy columns and pursued them to the bushes so rigorously that hardly any of them escaped. End quote. Now, while the Great Redoubt was retaken by Rayevsky's men, the story was not looking so grand elsewhere. A series of fletchers to the south had been captured, and now the French cavalry swirled around the plateau. It was now around 2 p.m, and Rayevsky's redoubt must have resembled an absolute slaughterhouse, his men having been under massive artillery bombardment for most of the day. Eventually, they would be rotated out, reserve troops taking their place. This is confirmed in the same letter as we quoted earlier on. Rayevsky went on to say, quote, "It remains to add a couple of words on the further actions of my corps, and that after destroying the enemy, it returned back to its places and maintained its positions against repeated enemy attacks until it had completely disappeared through losses in killed and wounded. The redoubt was then occupied by Major General Likhachev. Your Excellency himself knows that Major General Vasil Chikov gathered together the dispersed remnants of the 12th and 27th Divisions, and along with the Life Guard Litovsky regiments, held on to the important height on the very left end of our entire line. I do not have the power to describe the deeds of every general and field and company grade officer, but their exceptional courage is shown in that almost all of them fell where they stood. In respectfully requesting from your Excellency," so this is the Tsar he's writing to, "decorations for the field and company grade officers whom I have the honour to present to you. I also request that 3 generals, Vasil Chikov, Yermolov and Paskevich, be rewarded by being put forward for promotions, which I, as a corps commander, do not have the authority to approve. You yourself know that there was no occasion in which they did not demonstrate outstanding courage, effort, and military talent. I have the honour to enclose with this a list of field and company grade officers who showed themselves to be exceptional." End quote. Now, just a quick note there, a company officer is a lieutenant and a captain. A field officer is a major and a senior captain, major, and perhaps a lieutenant colonel. I'm not sure in the Russian army, but certainly in the British army was field officers that had the right to ride a horse. So, with the majority of his command killed and Rayevsky pulled out, we may as well finish off the story of the Rayevsky redoubt, hadn't we? It was eventually attacked from all sides by cavalry, and it would be the Saxon Garde du Corps riding in from the rear of the fortification that would take it. One avenue of attack from the south was defended by the 24th Infantry Regiment under General Likhachev. I've read the 24th Infantry, but Russian regiments weren't numbered like that. They tended to be after their location, so it could have been a Jaeger regiment. It could have been the 24th Jaegers, because Jaegers were numbered like that. But anyway, in order to avoid the shame of surrender, General Likhachev threw himself on the French bayonets, but after being clubbed unconscious, they took him prisoner. At about 2 p.m, the Rayevsky redoubt finally fell. Although it split the front line of the Russian army in half, it did not break them. The Russian Guard continued to fight into the night. French artillery wreaked a bloody toll on them. Conditions in the redoubt itself were shocking, even by Napoleonic battle standards. Sous-Lieutenant Dac later reflected, quote, so this is him writing about the redoubt. Quote, "Most of the dead were infantrymen who lay under dead horses, and the cavalrymen who had charged over them. This mix of men, weapons, horses, breastplates, iron and brass, cavalry helmets formed an indescribable scene. The horror of this incredible sight was increased by the moans of the dying who lay amongst the dead." End quote. Another writer, General Dumonceau, said, quote, "Passing behind the great redoubt, we saw its broad interior sloping sharply down towards us, all encumbered with corpses and dead horses jumbled up, with overturned cannon, cuirassiers, helmets, and all sorts of scattered wreckage in an indescribable confusion and disorder." And then finally, we're going to hear from Lieutenant H. Brandt of the Vistula Legion. He wrote, quote, "The Rayevsky redoubt and the area around it offered an aspect of what exceeded the worst horrors one could ever dream of. The approaches, the ditches, and the earthwork itself had disappeared under the amount of dead and dying, of an average depth of 6 to 8 men heaped upon one another." Now, the only thing worse than this would be when the French had to camp on the battlefield during the retreat from Moscow. That must have been truly horrendous. But again, here, the Russians had been defeated. They had forced Napoleon, however, to pay in blood. At the sharpest point of the battle, General Rayevsky, now wounded multiple times, including a serious leg wound, had kept his men in the fight. He claimed that his corps, originally about 10,000 strong, numbered 700 men the day after the battle. He was not a man given to excessive praise, believing that only the exemplary was good enough. However, when conceding to the bravery of his men had shown, he said to Bagration, quote, that he himself had witnessed how many lower ranks and officers, having received several wounds and bandaging them, returned to the battle as if to a feast. I cannot take enough of their bravery and art. All were heroes, end quote. Now, for his efforts, he was awarded the Order of St. George of the Third Degree, which would put him in later company with King Leopold I of Belgium and General Brusilov from the First War. Also, General Surovkin, but we'll brush over him. It was awarded for, according to Wikipedia, quote, senior military officers for the conduct of military operations to protect the motherland from attack by an external enemy, which resulted in the complete defeat of the enemy, for the execution of combat and other operations in other states aimed at restoring international peace and security, or for being a model of military science with feats that exemplify military prowess. I'm not sure there's a single word in that citation that doesn't apply to Nikolay Rayevsky. Despite this stand, once again, the army was forced to retreat, this time unmolested by the French. Utterly exhausted, they bivouacked on the battlefield itself. This gave the Russians the luxury of calling together a staff meeting at the village of Fili on the 13th of September, 1812. Until now, there had been friction between those who wanted to continue the Fabian delaying strategy and those who wanted to stand and fight to save Moscow. The latter camp had been headed by General Bagration, but after he had been mortally wounded at Borodino, the cause was taken up by General Bennigsen. The former remained the preferred strategy of Barclay de Tolly. The newly appointed Generalissimo Kutuzov waited to hear the arguments and then settled on one path or the other. Once that course of action was decided upon, that was it. That was going to happen. He would allow people to have their say now, but once Kutuzov's mind was made up, all efforts would go towards executing that grand strategy. Rayevsky counselled caution and that the retreat continue. Russia has suffered heavy losses in their last few battles, but reinforcements were making their way across the vast land to converge. Reinforcements Napoleon simply did not have. Eventually, the Fabians won out, and the army pulled back southeast of Moscow, leaving the road clear for the triumphant entrance of Napoleon into Russia's now desolate spiritual capital. For young men dragged off a farm in central France, or a wharf rat from Marseille, it must have been some sight. Sergeant Burgoyne wrote, and keep the first two lines in your head because we'll contrast them in a bit, quote, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon of the September the 14th, after passing through the great forest, we saw a hill some way off, and half an hour afterwards part of the army reached the highest point, signalling to us who were behind and shouting, Moscow! Moscow! It was indeed the great city. There we should rest after all our labours, for we of the Imperial Guard had marched more than 1,200 leagues without resting. It was a beautiful summer's day. The sun was reflecting on all the domes, spires and gilded palaces. Many capitals I have seen, such as Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, Vienna and Madrid, had only produced an ordinary impression in me, but this was quite different. The effect on it had to me, in fact to everyone, was magical, end quote. And so, in the former Russian capital, Napoleon and his men had a lovely winter snooze, ready to continue the invasion of 1813 and finally destroy the perfidious Russians, right? Alas, not to be. After an uprising against the French, the city was set on fire, either deliberately or by Russian saboteurs, or accidentally, no one really knows. Either way, we have a interesting counterpoint to Burgoyne from Jakob Walter, who, after the city was sabotaged, entering the city, wrote later, quote, on a march into the city, or rather on the march towards it, from a hill in a forest an hour and a half away, we saw the huge city laying before us. Clouds of fire, red smoke, great gilded crosses of the church towers glittered, shimmered and billowed up towards us from the city. There were broad streets, long straight alleys, tall buildings massively built of brick, church towers with burned roofs and half-melted bells, and copper roofs which had rolled from the buildings. Everything was uninhabited and uninhabitable. Napoleon agreed. The army was unable to survive in Moscow for the duration of the winter, and after some prevarication, the army made ready to withdraw. This isn't a video about Napoleon, it's a video about General Rayevsky. So what was he up to in the 5 weeks between the French entry to the city and their decision to withdraw? Kutuzov and his army had taken up a position southwest of Moscow. Imagine a V, with Borodino being the top of the left upright, Moscow the top of the right one, and the village of Tarotino at the bottom of the V. Now, that's where the Russian army was. Now, I'm going to digress a little bit here, because this shows, I think, the absolute brilliance of Kutuzov, something which is kind of hand-waved away, I think. I think people just, oh yeah, he was a great commander. This, I think, is a really good example of how he was great. His army, by being in this position, blocked the southern route of retreat for the French. Now, this would have been their preferred. It's a lot lower down, so it's a lot warmer, and the French army had already marched through the north of Russia, absolutely tearing apart any of the resources they had there. Remember, French armies lived off the land, and that's what gave them their speed. Now, this meant that the few resources not destroyed by the Russians in their retreat had been absolutely picked clean by the French going through. So he had to do everything he can to avoid going back that way. What he had to do was go through what's now Belarus and Ukraine. Ukraine is the flag of the country famously is blue and yellow. The yellow referring to the golden fields of wheat that Ukraine produces, and produced even then. In fact, if the French could retreat that way, they wouldn't even necessarily even have to leave Russian soil. They could have wintered quite easily in Minsk or perhaps even Kiev. By placing his army southwest of Moscow, Kutuzov was daring Napoleon to try and fight through his army to take this southern land route back to safety. Additionally, it also blocked any supplies from sympathetic people in the south, or maybe even another French army, from bringing supplies up to Moscow from these fertile lands. Now, the French did make some attempts, some probes to see the viability of this southern route. The Battle of Tarotino was a great victory for the Russians, a really vitally important one, with Murat's corps of Neapolitans getting an absolute mauling by the Cossacks, who captured 12 cannon, 30 wagons, and killed 2 generals for the loss of 500 men, which, I'll be honest, is a pretty good day's work. It could have been even better, though. The field commander, General Bennigsen, criticised Kutuzov's decision not to send additional troops to the battle. Such was his disgust with the field marshal that when accepting his congratulations on the victory, Bennigsen did not even get off his horse. In his report of the battle, he, Bennigsen, attributed the victory exclusively to himself, noting that this battle, quote, he had the honour of starting, continuing and finishing, end quote. Despite this loss, Napoleon decided the southwestern route was the only viable one, and so an advance guard moved out. The Russians moved north to meet them. Now, as we've said before twice already, escalation battles were pretty rare in the early years of the Napoleonic Wars. They tended to be a lot more set-piece battles. Now, of course, they did happen, Guttstadt, and we've already seen 2 earlier Russian ones. But one of the biggest and baddest escalation battles was the Battle of Maroy-Yaroslavets, where on the 24th of October 1812, a Russian general of infantry, Dmitry Dokhturov, entered the village of Maloy-Yaroslavets from the south, heading to meet up with the rest of the army. Unfortunately for him, my boy Eugène de Beauharnais and his corps of Italians had already seized the bridge over the Luzha River and the surrounding town. It will be up to Rayevsky and his 7th Corps to kick him out. Numbering about 10,000 men, Rayevsky's corps contained 2 divisions, 10 regiments, including the 5th and 6th Jaeger, and so Rayevsky must have been pretty confident as he launched his men to assault the town. After all, this is what the Russians do best. After heavy fighting, they pushed the Italians back, but only to the bridge. Realizing that attack was the best form of defense, Eugène then threw the 15th Italian Division to force the Russians out of the town. And having been forced out, Rayevsky rallied his men before launching another assault. So it went on across the day, the village changing hands no less than 8 times. Eventually, the Italian Guard had to get involved, with Eugene saying they had, quote, displayed qualities which entitled it evermore to rank amongst the bravest troops of Europe, end quote. While Rayevsky could no longer throw the Italians back, it did allow time for Kutuzov to fall back to a prepared position at Kaluga. Essentially, Kutuzov was going to force another Borodino on Napoleon, and the Emperor, he had neither the stomach nor the troops for that. Moving his army back north on the Smolensk road, they would go back to Poland the way they came. This decision would lead them to fight General Winter, and he would kill tens, if not hundreds of thousands of them. But Kutuzov knew that nature couldn't be expected to do all the work, and he trailed the French, swarms of Cossacks picking off the stragglers, Russian peasants extracting bloody and brutal revenge on any invaders that fell into their hands. Rayevsky and his 7th Corps remained part of the main force, keeping the sword in the back of the retreating enemy. By November, the French had reached the city that Rayevsky had fought so hard to defend, Smolensk. Napoleon, seeing that staying there would see him bottled up, struck out west on the morning of the 14th of November, along the paths he had taken just that summer, with Marshal Ney's corps forming the rearguard, leaving the city on the 17th. And it was now that the Russian winter would start to bite. On the 14th of November, the day Napoleon and his guard left Smolensk, a blizzard descended on the region. Temperatures plummeted to minus 24 degrees centigrade, and 1.5 meters of snow fell in a single day. That's minus 11 Fahrenheit and 5 feet in freedom units. The conditions we think of when we think of the Russian retreat from Moscow, or the French retreat from Moscow, started here. And as bad as the snowfall was, Ney was not scheduled to leave Smolensk until the 17th, so he and his men were spared the worst of it. They followed the rest of the retreating French and Allied army down a gully created by the Lozvinka stream, but unfortunately for him, Miloradovich had moved to intercept him, and the following day, the Second Battle of Krasnoy took place. Despite being offered the chance to surrender, that wasn't the game of the bravest of the brave, and he commenced a blistering attack, punching through the first 2 Russian lines and reaching the crest of a hill that overlooked the stream. At this vital moment, Lieutenant General Nikolay Rayevsky launched his counterattack, pushing the French back to the summit of the hill. An Englishman, General Sir Robert Wilson, attaché to the Russians, wrote of Rayevsky's final assault, quote, 40 pieces of cannon loaded with grape, simultaneously on the instant, vomited their flames and poured their deadly shower on the assailants. The survivors intrepidly rushed forward with a desperate energy. Part reached the crest of the hill and almost touched the batteries. The Russians, most in advance, shouting their "Hurrah!" sprang forward with fixed bayonets and without firing a musket. The sanguinary but short struggle ensued. The enemy could not maintain their footing and were driven headlong down the ravine. The Ulan of the Guard at the same time charged, swept through the shattered ranks, and captured an eagle. The brow and sides of the hill were covered with dead and dying. All the Russian arms were dripping with gore, and the wounded as they lay bleeding and shivered in the snow called for death, as the greatest mercy that could be ministered in their hopeless state. End quote. So that's pretty spicy stuff. This effectively destroyed 3 corps as a military unit, and only about 1,000 Frenchmen remained. The next day, after a disastrous crossing of the Dnieper, this fell to under 1,000, and the last major battle of 1812 for Napoleon and the Russians would be a couple of weeks later, the Battle of Berezina against Wittgenstein's army of the right wing. Rayevsky was spared its horrors, and perhaps that was just as well. Having suffered several wounds, not least of which was a second serious leg wound at Borodino, Rayevsky was granted leave to recuperate. With the French in full retreat, he returned to St. Petersburg and his family. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time talking about the various awards and distinctions that Rayevsky was awarded, and I've done that because it was quite important to his character. It allowed him to advance socially whilst being above the politics of St. Petersburg. As we saw in his letter earlier on, he was in fact a man of action. This peace stuff didn't really help him out, and Ivan Lazhennikov said of him that he, quote, never fussed about orders. In the heat of the battle, he gave orders calmly, clearly, sensibly, as if he were at home. He always asked the performer whether his order was clear, and if he thought that it was not clear enough, he would repeat without a heart. He had a special talent to bind subordinates to himself, end quote. Denis Davidov said, quote, Rayevsky is always the same with himself and elder equal, before the troops in peacetime and in the fires of battle, in the circle of acquaintances and strangers, calm, friendly, modest, and at the same time strong, feeling his strength and unwittingly giving it to feel, end quote. Rayevsky had now been fighting almost continuously for a decade, and the wounds he had sustained in this latest campaign were to worsen on his trip home. This meant that by the time he reached Baltishka in January, he was in a critical condition, with one source saying that he was unconscious by the time he had reached the house. It would take him until the spring of that year to recover, but as soon as he did, he would be straight back to the front, now in modern Germany. He would not be amongst the green-coated infantrymen. Instead, he would serve as chief of staff under an Austrian commander, Field Marshal Schwarzenberg, and his army of Bohemia. Rayevsky had little faith in the ability of non-Russian generals, and so it was evident when his new commander was defeated at the Battle of Dresden, forcing the Allies to fall back. Chasing him up was your boy, General Dominique Vandamme, with his corps. This was no mere token follow-up, though. A victory for France here would bottle up the entire Allied army, allowing Napoleon to trap them in the Bohemian mountains and perhaps perform for them a final rhapsody. The French fell upon the Allies, ultimately led by General Osterman Tolstoy at Kulm. As Chief of Staff, it was Rayevsky's job to coordinate the different forces under Tolstoy's command and ensure that his orders were carried out. This is a difficult enough job normally in the polyglot Austrian army, but now with the addition of a Russian division, it would be even more so. Luckily, despite a furious assault from Vandamme, an accidental flank attack from the Prussian army under von Kleist meant that the French were defeated, surrendering to the Allies, with Vandamme himself being captured. For this, Rayevsky would be granted another medal, this time the Imperial Order of St. Prince Vladimir, First Class. Now, we've stepped away from the table of ranks, but this award meant another step up in levels of aristocracy. Again, this meant that his new level was hereditary. Now, perhaps not the most illustrious of awards, I must say. The most famous people I can find with this were Tchaikovsky and the guy that designed the helicopters, Sikorsky. So not quite so prestigious, that one. But from the Austrians, he did get the Military Order of Maria Theresa Third Class. So the Austrians were obviously pretty happy with his performance. Unfortunately for them, he wouldn't be with the Austrians for very long, though, being promoted to command the key formation for the Russians, a corps of grenadiers. This unit, under the overall command of Grand Duke Constantine himself, comprised over 9,000 of the Tsar's best infantry, including the Ekaterinoslav, Archangel, Kiev, Moscow, Little Russia, and St. Petersburg regiments of grenadiers. Be under no illusion, this was one of the most experienced, well-trained, toughest, and hardest fighting formations anywhere in the Allied army, perhaps second only to the Russian Imperial Guard, and perhaps thirdly only to the French Imperial Guard as one of the premier formations in the world. Luckily, the 3rd Grenadier Corps was marching to a medium-sized, sleepy town in some backwater in Upper Saxony. I mean, this town's never really going to bother history much, unless you're a 30 years war nerd. I mean, who's ever heard of Leipzig, right? On the 16th of October 1813, the Battle of Leipzig would become the largest Europe had ever seen, or would see for over a century. Amongst the 365,000 men on the Allied side was our man, General Nikolay Rayevsky. I talked before about the Battle of Leipzig. Imagine it like a dartboard, with the bullseye being Leipzig and the triples and the doubles being the villages around the city that were fortified by the French. The Allies have to attack from the outside and work their way in, with the non-doubles and trebles, just the normal things, being open-ish ground between the villages. It's not perfect, but it's good enough for a general picture of the setup of the battle. Now, being part of the Guard, Rayevsky's corps of grenadiers were positioned in the reserve, ready to break through and shore up a weakened line, or perhaps exploit a falling back enemy and turn that into a rout. Now, this meant that they watched the beginning of the battle from a relatively safe distance, not particularly needing to get involved. Now, that said, I don't know how, but Rayevsky still managed to get himself wounded, suffering a head wound and leaving him to have the entire battle with a bloody bandage around his scalp. But this was as nothing, for fortunately for our man, he didn't need to worry about missing the party, because if he wasn't going to go to the party, then the party was going to come to him. The Allies while they'd spent most of the morning pushing the French back, taking positions that had formed the doubles ring of our Leipzig dartboard, they were now working on the triples ring. Units formed up for assaults and reserve units were positioned, ready to reinforce them. Napoleon decided that he needed to relieve the pressure a little bit. In what must have been one of the most incredible sights in the entirety of warfare, Marshal Murat led a charge of 80 squadrons of cavalry to sweep the outer dartboard ring clear. Men from the French Carabineers, their brass armour gleaming, rode alongside the reds, blues and yellows of hussars with Italian dragoons, Saxon cuirassiers, all forming a tsunami of horseflesh, planned to wash away the Allied troops and allow some breathing space for the defenders. While the Allied cavalry scattered out of the way, this was not a viable option for the grenadiers of Rayevsky, and so the order went out, "Form square!" These grenadiers, some of the most well-trained troops in Europe, did just that. In the words of Mikhailovsky Danilevsky, these grenadier squares were, quote, like a boulder in the middle of an indignant mass, end quote. Another witness wrote, quote, the hounds of the French cavalry with the tide swallowed up the grenadier regiments, curled up in hazel and rushed into their gaps, seeking to wedge themselves. The courage of the French was uselessly exhausted against the brave men led by Rayevsky, end quote. Looking down from his vantage point, seeing these small islands of green green and white in amongst a tide of horseflesh, the Tsar reportedly said, "What grenadiers!" But he wouldn't have a clear view of them for long, for as the French cavalry rode past them, then they would unleash musketry into them. In turn, the French cavalry deployed horse artillery to flay these packed targets with canister fire. One of these small canister balls hit Rayevsky in the shoulder, spinning him round. He reportedly pulled the bullet from the wound and said, "See how I bleed for Russia." Another source said that he yelled a slightly more believable, "We shall not yield, we will fight to the last breath." This was his second wound of the day, but you don't get a nearly 2-hour-long video on Napoleonic Wargaming if you only take 2 wounds and that's the end of it, by God, sir. So he continued to fight. Eventually, the Allied cavalry broke off, but they had been held up long enough for the Allies to prepare their counterattack. Seeing the enemy cavalry disappear into the distance, the surviving grenadiers knew what was coming next. The infantry assault. Sure enough, French troops under the command of Oudinot and Victor pushed forward, taking the villages of Gossau and Auenheim, although I have spelt it heard Uenheim, 2 of the trebles on our Leipzig dartboard. These were not any ragtag infantry either. Napoleon had sent in the young guard. Rayevsky, bloodied, wounded, and leading a corps that had already seen a campaign's worth of action in one day, formed column, and, with their shouting their famous cry, "Hurrah!" stormed the village of Auenheim, throwing the French back out. This, too, was carried out under the gaze of the Tsar, who, seeing the superb control Rayevsky had over his men, would promote him on the field to General of Cavalry. He would not be around to take advantage of this promotion for long, though. The wound in his shoulder, almost certainly not helped by him digging around in it, had begun to fester, and soon he was pulled out of the line and brought to Weimar to recover. Here he would be seriously ill for a month, with doctors giving him a slim chance of survival for most of that time. Remember, this is the same time that another of our Napoleonic figures, Scharnhorst, would die to the festering of his foot wound. He took a long time to recuperate from this wound, being out of action for nearly 6 months, returning to the front lines in early 1814, just in time to participate in a battle that I'd not heard of until researching this video, the 2-day Battle of Arcis-sur-Aube. Rayevsky would command a corps in this action, namely the 6th Corps, consisting of 3 divisions. 2 were made up of infantry, commanded by Prince Andrei Ivanovich Gorshakov and Duke Eugen of Württemberg, and the 3rd Cavalry under General Lieutenant Peter Petrovich Pahlen. All 3 divisional commanders had over a decade of military experience each, and this would surely be one of the premier line formations of the army. Duke Eugen is also a fascinating dude. Not only did he hold off Van Damme despite being heavily outnumbered, but later in life he would go on to compose several operas. Anyway, at this point, he's far away from his violins because he's staring down Napoleon. And on the 2nd day, Duke Eugen, Prince Andrei and General Pahlen, together with their 16,500 infantry, 3.5 cavalry, would be ordered into action by their corps commander, Prince Rayevsky. They were the spearhead of the Russian army, and according to Petrie, they would capture an entire brigade of French cavalry. As was so often in the case in the reverse of roles from 1812, the battle would result in a French retreat, this time further into France towards Paris. Hot on their heels were the Allies, the point of the sabre in their backs being Rayevsky's 6th Corps. On the 31st of March 1814, after a spirited but short resistance, Paris fell, and the Tsar rode triumphantly into the city. At his side, and before the King of Prussia and Prince Schwarzenberg, rode General Nikolay Nikolayevich Rayevsky. This would be a fitting end to a glorious military career. He would retire after the war to his estates in what's now Ukraine and become a private citizen. He fell out with favour with the Tsar, and his son-in-law becoming a major player in the Decembrists movement. I don't really want to go into that too much here because, the video is going to be 2 hours long as it is. This could add another half an hour, 40 minutes, although I am going to do a video on the Decembrists at some point. When at his estates, Rayevsky loved gardening, appreciated a lively conversation, and was an excellent storyteller, being acquainted with a young Alexander Pushkin. He does have rules in black powder. They are quite limited, but there's only so much you can do with such an absolutely fascinating man. I would give his troops, any troops under his command, Jaegers, particularly Jaegers in a defended area, I would give them either stubborn or the rule I'm trying to think of, British infantry get it in the Zulu Wars, where they automatically pass their first morale test. I'd probably go for that one. So what led me down this rabbit hole of researching General Rayevsky? Well, to be honest, the first thing was just having heard of the Rayevsky redoubt. I was like, well, who's this Rayevsky guy? He's not someone you hear of. Let's find out more about him. But as I researched him more and more, what I loved about him, what I genuinely really respect the man, because he was a very modern military commander trapped in his own time. He was an opponent of corporal punishment, although unlike Barclay de Tolly, he didn't protest the abolition of the cane system. So while he was against it, he understood his place in the table of ranks in his own time. In private conversation, he urged his officers to what we would today call serve to lead. He said that they were to influence their men by personal example, learn to find a common language with the soldiers, and improve their own training. It was at this time that Russian officers, many Russian officers, were considered their men as basically their personal slaves, and in many cases they effectively were their personal slaves at best. Rayevsky wanted to see regulations in the army. He said, quote, based on reasonable vigour, full responsibility and impeccable performance of his duties. He demanded the absolute best from his officers, and, as I said earlier on, the exceptional was the minimum requirement as far as Rayevsky was concerned, but he lived that himself. An interesting tidbit that I really like and really humanises the man some more is he was the godfather of many of the children of the troops under his command. And not just the officers, but the privates and NCOs as well. He was clearly well loved by his men, and when he was back on his estate, he was clearly well loved by the people who worked for him there too. Unfortunately, he would not enjoy retirement for that long. He died at the tender young age of 51 on the 16th of September 1829 at the village of Boltishka in Chigirinsky County, Kiev Province. He was broken-hearted by the exile of his daughter, who had gone to join her husband, his son-in-law, after the failed Decembrist revolt, as well as the death of several of his grandchildren. He will be buried in his family vault in the village of Razumovka, which hopefully I'll be able to visit one day, but maybe not anytime soon. And on his tombstone was inscribed, Here lies General Rayevsky. He was a Russian shield in Smolensk and a sword in Paris. Well, there you go. That is the story of General Nikolay Nikolayevich Rayevsky. I hope you enjoyed it. It's quite a long one, the longest video I've ever done, even longer than the Muhammad Ali Pasha video. I have divided it into 3 sections. Let me know if that was useful for you. If in future you would rather I did them as 3 separate parts, let me know in the comments down below. I hope you enjoy it. I thank you so much for sticking with me for this double feature-length episode. I know these videos aren't perhaps the most popular, but this has been an absolute labour of love for me. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.